Excellent. That was a wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Mic's good? All right, good. That was a wonderful introduction. I first want to start by thanking everyone that is attending in the audience. I understand that this is a typical rainy day, but I appreciate everybody getting through the traffic and the rain here. It's been a wonderful experience visiting your community college for the first time. I am a product of a community college as well from Los Angeles, and I teach at a community college in Santa Rosa, California, where I coordinate the Emoja program. I find it to be one of the most democratic institutions in our country, this open access college institution, where people can really change their lives. That's what it did for me, and that's why I constantly go back to it. I like to speak at community colleges across the country, and I like to work there as an institution because I find it to be so wonderful. And looking out at this audience, this is what I see. I see that this representation of democracy and inclusion within our country. I also want to thank the MLK committee and all of the students and faculty and staff that invited me here and have been so gracious in inviting me. I did attend college at Bowling Green State, where James Baldwin had one of his only teaching appointments. Most of my seminar classes were in the James Baldwin seminar room, and it's actually that picture that kind of hung above the classroom. And I'll be honest, there were times in my PhD program where I didn't think I was going to make it. It was a very difficult and long process, and something that was incredibly challenging for me. And I would look up at that picture right there, and Jimmy would be telling me, "You're going to make it," right? He had just had this tremendous influence on me, both in terms of his activism, in terms of his novels, and in terms of his essay writing. He specifically loved to work with young people because he said that he loved to see the future. He loved to be able to see and touch the future. Let me see if I can get this advanced. Okay. So James Baldwin was one of the most gifted artists and essayists of the 20th century and one of the most visible leaders of the Black freedom movement. And yet, And yet, as the New York Times recently verified, he has largely been deleted from history books and removed from high school and college reading lists. He was what was Black philosopher Cornel West calls part of the Black prophetic tradition that stretches all the way back to the anti-slavery movement. From Harriet Tubman to Frederick Douglass, from Ida B. Wells to Marcus Garvey, from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Ella Baker 50 years ago to Cornel West and Dr. James Cone today. The Black prophetic tradition has always been the conscience of America, trying to get us to become a more perfect union. James Baldwin was part of that great tradition. James Baldwin's voice so clearly speaks to us 50 years later that all lives matter, but that the only way we can achieve this noble and universal goal inherited from the Enlightenment and the French and American revolutions is to concede, with love in our hearts for everyone, that we will all perish if we do not focus special attention to help the most oppressed. We do this not out of charity or pity, Baldwin teaches us, but out of a radical solidarity for all living people. For Baldwin, that meant eloquently but assertively saying, using today's language, that all Black lives matter. While we celebrate the 50th anniversary of many of the most important legislative victories in the civil rights movement, such as the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right now it is an important time to challenge the narrative, the traditional civil rights narrative that excludes certain people, demonizes certain people, and sanitizes the images of others, thus robbing us of a fuller, more complex picture of our history and selling us a story that is designed to make us feel good rather than engaging us in the important work of self-confrontation and growth. While we strive to become more educated people, as all of us in this room are trying to do, Baldwin asks that we must reject overly simplistic stories and instead wrestle with the difficult and often ugly history of race hatred and white supremacy in the United States. In his writing and in his very being, Baldwin disrupts our comfortable mythology about civil rights. This is one of the most important things, most of the important rewards we get from reading him. He does not fit the popular story American history books like to tell. Unlike Dr. King and several high-profile leaders in the civil rights movement, he did not come from a college-educated background. He was not middle class. He came from a desperately poor background in Harlem, abused by his father and by the police. He was in exile in America because he was black, and he was in exile in the black community because he was openly gay, but he was totally, totally unashamed. And that was one of the most important things we learned from him. Despite not attending college, he wrote and spoke with breathtaking eloquence and an uncanny power of observation brought together in a powerful moral argument. But it was the fact that he questioned the value of integration that was based only upon liberal tolerance that made him a critic of the mainstream civil rights movement, but a mentor and friend to the students. Baldwin thought so much energy was placed on top-down administrative federal action, particularly through the courts, to force desegregation, and not enough energy was spent to desegregate the human mind and the human heart. He especially did not like the paternalistic attitude that many white liberals had that viewed black people as objects of charity, people that needed to be lifted up to the level of white society. He felt that we were locked in a deep and profound moral struggle that very few people were willing to engage with truthfully. This is a clip of a 1963 interview conducted after James Baldwin took a delegation of black and white activists to meet with Robert Kennedy, who at that time was the Attorney General of the United States. The meeting ended in very bitter feelings on both sides. In fact, it ended with Lorraine Hansberry screaming at Robert Kennedy that she was going to use her fame and money to arm black men across the country. So I believe that it succinctly expresses the dimensions of the moral struggle he wrestled with daily. Pay particular attention to his statement that the country is suffering from moral apathy and from a death of the heart. Because while our circumstances are slightly different today, I think it speaks clearly to our present moment. Do I need to do anything with the sound or turn it up at all? Or just play? Okay.
And there are days, this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. How precisely you're going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. And to be here means that you can't be anywhere else. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters.
Well, Jim, I can see...
It's a terrible indictment.
Yes.
And I mean every word I say. It doesn't matter any longer, and I'm speaking for myself, for Jimmy Baldwin, and I think I'm speaking for a great many other Negroes, too. It doesn't matter any longer what you do to me. You can put me in jail. You can kill me. But by the time I was 17, you've done everything that you could do to me. The problem now is, how are you going to save yourselves?
So I apologize about the low volume. Let's try to see if we can fix that problem. Ooh. That's probably the mic. All right. Okay. Instead of pity and tolerance, he was interested in nothing short than a moral revolution, the beginning of which must be confronting the race problem. In a debate he had with William Buckley Jr., the founder of the modern conservative movement at Cambridge in 1965, this was Cambridge, England, they continually wanted to have the debate in the United States, but it constantly got canceled because of bomb threats, many of the times when he wanted to speak on college campuses. He makes clear the urgency for this moral revolution. If we do not recognize the humanity of black people, our experiment in democracy in the United States will perish and all humanity will suffer.
It is a terrible thing for entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath it. Until that moment, until the moment comes, when Americans, we, the American people, it is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes, when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
All right. I apologize about the video playback, but we're good college students. We'll push forward. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we understand technical difficulties at times. While he wanted integration, the only valuable model of integration he advocated was one based upon two intertwined revolutionary acts of solidarity. First and foremost, integration must be based upon black self-confidence and pride, grounded in an understanding and deep appreciation of the painful yet inspiring struggle for freedom throughout American history. Secondly, integration must be based upon white self-confrontation with their history. They must admit that the civic mythology they have been taught distorts their perceptions of themselves and black people, drowns their humanity in hatred, and robs them of the capacity to be truly free. To Baldwin, these two acts must be fused together, black self-confidence and white self-confrontation, in a loving struggle to heal each other while at the same time building a better country. He was surrounded by liberal black leaders on one side, telling him, just wait, and change will gradually come. And on the other side, black militant leaders telling him to pick up the gun, because white people only respect violence. While Baldwin understood the need for militant self-defense, and he did not criticize young people who wanted to defend themselves, he argued to use your mind instead of the gun. For Baldwin, a liberatory education was the key to freedom. This was why he supported the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Freedom School project that is pictured here. He argued that a critical mind which sought the historical causality of oppression was the most important tool for humanizing the individual. The great problem to Baldwin was that certain groups of people were invested in a false historical narrative that justified their superiority, in the case of white people, by falsely justifying the inferiority of black people, creating, in other words, a false binary opposition. This robs people of their critical reasoning and thus their freedom. In fact, it robs them of their very ability to be free. What was needed was the development of a critical mind that disabused people from false narratives and lovingly guided them through the painful process of self-exploration, self-confrontation, and growth. Where did Baldwin learn his self-confidence and sense of pride? He was the product of the Great Migration, which many of you have probably studied in your classes. His family comes from the South, just like an enormous number of black families, moving from out of the South in the turn of the century all the way up to the 1960s. Great, enormous waves of migration. This was the biggest internal migration in U.S. history. These were migrants seeking escape from Klan terror, Jim Crow segregation, slave-like tenant farming and convict leasing, and various different agricultural blights that had happened at that time. If anybody listens to the blues, you hear about the boll weevil, and you hear about, various different floods that happened at this time. He identified himself as a Southern migrant, and yet he identified more closely in the northern urban ghetto, where so many families were concentrated in places like Chicago, Detroit, Oakland, and where he grew up in Harlem. His father was a Pentecostal preacher, so he does not come from that Baptist heritage. He himself was a lay preacher as a teenager. Those of you that have read Go Tell It on the Mountain, it's much of an autobiographical story of his experience in the Pentecostal church and his experience of their rejection of him, his father's rejection of him, and his coming into a certain independent self-awareness. Also his movement towards a war production factory in World War II, and his experience with living outside of segregated Harlem in an integrated war production factory and experiencing racism, that kind of exclusion for the first time. His first book of essays in 1955, Notes from a Native Son, deals with this in many interesting ways. He worried the authority of the church, particularly the Baptist church, where so many black families came from, that provided a nonviolent outlet to the voice of suffering, was losing its hold on the young black people in the urban northern ghettos. And also that the grand promises of how good life was going to be in the North, and also what the defeat of fascism was going to mean for freedom for black people, all ended up being false promises. And the crushing realization of those false promises created a situation in these urban ghettos in the North of enormous amounts of poverty. He was always interested not in the students in college. He was always interested in who he called the brothers on the block, or in The Fire Next Time, who he called the people hanging out in the tenements, the people in the whiskey-soaked and wine-soaked hallways he talked about. He was also a product of, he was born in 1924, he was a product of the Harlem Renaissance. In fact, County Cullen was his 8th grade teacher, if you can imagine that. Buford Delaney, who was a gifted Harlem Renaissance painter, was a mentor of him and gave him his first apartment to live outside of when his father threw him out when he was a teenager. His father died when he was about 18. Alain Locke was the father of the Harlem Renaissance movement and really the father of this notion of the civil rights that one must put their best foot forward, right? A politics of respectability, of a certain kind of performance for white audiences to gain respectability. He was a product of that, but he rejected that in many ways, that, like Malcolm X did. He was interested in how one develops a sense of self-confidence and pride by not seeing oneself as a victim. He connected to a long line of people who continued that fight in the face of overwhelming oppression. He was interested in how one attains a certain existential sense of self-worth and dignity when looked at history from the perspective of people that were overcoming trauma. He says in a beautiful quote in The Fire Next Time that a man who is forced each day to snatch his manhood, his identity, out of the fire of human cruelty that rages to destroy it, achieves his own authority, and that is unshakable. This is because in order to save his life, he is forced to look beneath appearances, to take nothing for granted, to hear the meaning behind the words. If one is continually surviving the worst that life can bring, one essentially ceases to be controlled by fear of what life can bring. Whatever it brings must be borne. Right? He says to his beloved nephew, in the introduction of The Fire Next Time, his nephew's pictured here, one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general and the American Negro history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. He says to his nephew, black people, quote, in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable and monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, the very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off. Not only did he do this with his prophetic voice and his poetic voice, with that righteous moral tone, he also did it with humor. Let's see if we can get this.
Now, when you were starting out as a writer, you were a black, impoverished homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
It was so outrageous you could not go any further, you know. It had to be, so you had to find a way to use it.
Yeah. I'm very fascinated by that position that he had. He felt they couldn't take anything more away from him, right? And because he did not need their charity, he could write whatever he wanted. He was in a position of great moral authority in that sense. He had already been rejected by the people that loved him the most, and he had carved his own sense of identity out of that. So he had a fierceness about him that was extraordinarily wise. I've been trying, in my class, I struggled to try to translate that attitude that he had into kind of the language of young people today. So I ran a caption contest in my class. So I had students kind of make a caption of this picture. This is him with John Lewis, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who's a long-time serving congressperson now. So this is the caption that won. I'm trying to translate this attitude that he had of not being ashamed. Is this translated? This is the one that won. That's the caption that won. They tried to translate it. You can tell me later whether the students captured what young people, how they talk today. But the major question that confronted Baldwin was, once a black person develops, in the face of great odds, a sense of self-worth and pride, how can it be used to get white people to confront their history? This was a major question to him. What does one do with racial pride, and how can one get white people to confront their history? He tried to develop a position between the two great factions in mid-century black freedom struggle. On one side, the King-led civil rights movement grounded in the Christian church, and on the other side, the black Muslim movement grounded in the Nation of Islam. Baldwin asked, should we use our sense of our own self-worth to convince racist white people that black people should be allowed to function normally in society? In other words, should black people use their self-pride to earn acceptance? Should we use our renewed sense of pride to show that black people are better than everyone else? Should we portray a certain racial black superiority, he asks. What he does is try to create a synthesis between these two forces. The King-led civil rights movement stated that if we constantly, quote, put our best foot forward and act in every way as more moral than we are perceived by white people, then we will finally gain a tolerant acceptance. Baldwin was critical because this strategy placed pressure on black people to perform for white people, and it also led to a kind of inter-community policing of acceptable lifestyles, acceptable language, and acceptable behaviors. This is why Baldwin was disinvited from speaking at the March on Washington. His speech needed to be given to a white person to read. And in the strangest of all worlds, it was given to Charlton Heston to read. Yeah. So James Baldwin's speech was read by Charlton Heston at the March on Washington. This was also why Bayard Rustin, who was an openly gay black civil rights leader and also the day-to-day logistical organizer of the March on Washington, a brilliant tactician and a lieutenant of A. Philip Randolph, one of the leading black unionists within the country at the time, was also shunned from the civil rights movement. The behind the scenes of what was going on in the March on Washington is a fascinating story, and I strongly encourage you taking a look at a documentary on Bayard Rustin's life called Brother Outsider. It's available on Netflix, and it's quite fascinating.
Martin's very rare, very great man. Martin's rare for two reasons, partly because just because he is, and because he's a real Christian, and he really believes in nonviolence. He's arrived at something in himself, which permits him, allows him to do it. And he still has great moral authority in the South. There's none whatever in the North. Poor Martin has gone through God knows what kind of hell to awaken the American conscience. But Martin has reached the end of his rope. There's some things Martin can't do. Martin's only one man. Martin can't solve the nation's central problem by himself. There are lots of people, lots of black people I mean now, who don't go to church no more and don't listen to Martin, you know. And who anyway are themselves produced by civilization, which has always glorified violence, unless the Negro had the gun. So that Martin is undercut by the performance of the country. The country is only concerned about nonviolence if it seems that I'm going to get violent. It's not worried about nonviolence if it's some Alabama sheriff.
This argument for an acceptance that must be earned through good deeds performed for the white man's benefit only to gain their tolerance grated on the minds of young poor black people who were tired of waiting for their freedom. To these young people, the most moral thing to do was to act as though the Jim Crow laws did not exist, to expose their immorality. Just sit down at the lunch counter. The law does not exist. We're just going to sit down, and that's going to be that. To Baldwin, it was not black people who had already suffered so much who needed to earn white people's acceptance by proving they were civilized. It was white people who had to earn the acceptance of black people. White people had to confront their history of lynch terror and bottomlessly cruel oppression in order to be released from that history, in order to prove their humanity to people of color. For a younger generation, particularly those from the South, Dr. King's message of nonviolence began to lose its hold, particularly as the beatings, the jailings, the bombings, and the killings continued. This is a clip of Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, speaking.
Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none.
A few words about Martin Luther King's nonviolence movement.
I think Dr. King is a great man, full of compassion. He's full of mercy, and he's very patient. He is a man who could accept the uncivilized behavior of white Americans, their unceasing taunts, and still have in his heart forgiveness. Unfortunately, I am from a younger generation. I am not as patient as Dr. King, nor am I as merciful as Dr. King. And their unwillingness to deal with someone like Dr. King just means they have to deal with this young generation.
Stokely Carmichael's words, he later renamed himself Kwame Ture, if you look him up. I think his words as a young person within that movement are very nicely articulated by Nina Simone's song, Mississippi Goddamn. It was the first time on radio that the word goddamn had been used. It's an amazing song, and I strongly encourage you to listen to the whole thing. But I think this verse from it, Lord have mercy on this land of mine, we're all going to get it in due time. I don't belong here, I don't belong there. I've even stopped believing in prayer, right? She also said, you kept telling me to be like a lady, and you'd stop calling me Sister Sadie. I don't believe you anymore, and onward. She had a very interesting, that song represents a very interesting change within the civil rights movement and is a very good, important artifact. If Martin Luther King believed that black people could receive, could If Martin Luther King believed we could get white people to confront their history by appealing to their conscience, Malcolm X argued that this could only happen by picking up the gun. He argued that white people only respected power and force, that in defending themselves, black people would gain respect. Rather than condemn these militant factions, Baldwin tried instead to understand them, and more importantly, to understand their popularity. But even though he understood where they were coming from, he did not agree. Most importantly, he tried to understand why oppressed young people were attracted to Malcolm X.
You said something that you cannot expect them to remain
You can't-
constantly nonviolent.
No, you can't. You can't. And furthermore, there were always, these students that we're talking about, a minority. The students we're talking about, when I was in Tallahassee, there were some students protesting. But there were many, 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 many more students who had given up, who were desperate, and whom Malcolm X can reach, for example, much more easily than I can.
What do you mean?
What Malcolm tells them, in effect, is that they should be proud of being black, and God knows that they should be. That's a very important thing to hear in a country which assures you you should be ashamed of it. Of course, in order to do this, what he does is destroy a truth and invent a history. What he does is say, you're better because you're black. Well, of course, that isn't true. That's the trouble.
Do you think that this is an appealing approach, and that the black Muslims, in preaching black supremacy, seek to exploit the frustration of the Negro?
I don't think, put it as simply as I can, and without trying now to investigate whatever the motives of any given Muslim leader may be. It is the only movement in the country which we can call grassroots. I hate to say that, but it's true. Because it is only, when Malcolm talks, or one of the Muslim ministers talk, they articulate for all the Negro people who hear them, who listen to them, they articulate their suffering. The suffering which has been in this country so long denied. That's Malcolm's great authority over any of his audiences. He corroborates their reality. He tells them that they really exist.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fascinating and provocative claim that Malcolm X ran the only real grassroots organization within the black freedom struggle at that time. And it runs quite contrary to the dominant message. And especially because he was most interested in who was not ignoring the people that nobody cared about, who was not ignoring the people on the corner, the people in the hallways, the people that weren't going to college, who was not dividing the black community into, to use the language of today, the way that the New York Times said, well, Mike Brown was no angel, right? That there are thugs in this world, and there are people that are deserving of our support. He was not interested in that dichotomy. To him, all children were angels, and all children had an untapped and an amazing potential that was being ignored. And what those people needed was to be listened to. And if you look at his documentary, like Take This Hammer, he would go around to various different communities with, it was PBS at the time, KCET, in Hunters Point or in South Chicago or in East St. Louis or in West Baltimore or in Harlem. And he would just listen. He would just listen to young people to try to gain a sense of why they were being influenced by the black Muslim movement. And that's the kernel of how he wrote The Fire Next Time. Baldwin believed that the only mechanism by which white people will confront their history is through self-confrontation, guided by a radical social movement that was guided by a transformative love. In this way, he is similar to Dr. King. But he did not ground his philosophy in love only in a Christian doctrine of love your enemy because they know not what they do. That they know not what they do was the problem to Baldwin. He said white people are convinced of their innocence. Ta-Nehisi Coates makes a very good point about this in his new memoir, Between the World and Me, about this white self-exoneration, which I strongly encourage you to read. Toni Morrison has said that Ta-Nehisi Coates is the new James Baldwin, which is a fascinating statement. He based his strategy on a more politically radical philosophy of love. He believed love will lead to radical self-confrontation and joint transformation. In fact, he believed this was the only hope for a future in the United States. In healing and in transforming each other, they will at the same time transform society. This is an act of radical solidarity. Rather than white people believing themselves to be the standard of civilization in the Western world, what Baldwin is arguing is nothing less than a total transformation of what we understand to mean civilized, along the lines of a radical humanism that sees the end of the racial nightmare as the key that unlocks the door to a truer and more complete sense of freedom. He says to his beloved nephew in The Fire Next Time, the quote on the board, "The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them," meaning white people. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. He goes on, "But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become." You can hear the strains of Langston Hughes, right? America never was America to me, you know? The Harlem Bard. All right. Let's hear this in the debate.
That no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible,
Meaning white
and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is gaslit. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse.
Baldwin's great skill was in trying to constantly ask the question nobody asks. In short, he constantly reversed the paradigm to gain a higher critical perspective. Rather than thinking of black people as poor victims, he wanted white people to think of themselves as victims. He argues in The Fire Next Time that, quote, "White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well never be, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it no longer will be needed." So this, in this sense, is a fascinating reversal of the dominant paradigm. So if I, as a white person, take as my only self-definition this heavenly revelation that at least I'm not black, I rob myself of a greater freedom that is available to me if I throw that down. And the people that have held on to status rather than solidarity have lived markedly worse lives in our country. If you look just empirically at the data, this is not a subjective question. If you look empirically at the data, in states in which that cultural white identity has been held so fervently, It's like sand. The tighter you hold it, the faster it slips through your fingers, because life indicators like longevity, like high school graduation, like infant mortality, like all of these quality of life indicators are far less in these states than in other states. So he's on to something extraordinarily profound for us to understand and to wrap our heads around. And this is the most interesting and challenging part of my conversation. By the mid-60s, we see a greater synthesis happening outward towards the various different movements. I painted a fairly stark dichotomy between Dr. King and Malcolm X at the beginning of my talk. But if you see towards the end of Malcolm's life, when he leaves the Nation of Islam and he forms the Organization of Afro-American Unity, you see him going, and especially after his trip to Mecca, where he sees the vast multiracial diversity of the Islamic faith, you see a great transformation in his thinking. Also, Dr. King, I mean, we have this image of Dr. King as somebody who led a bus boycott and then had a dream and then went to sleep and then died or something. Post-1963, he went through a fairly radical transformation. You see this, you see hints of this at the movie Selma at the end of the movie, when he starts making the speeches about economic civil rights. He came to believe that civil rights alone were quite hollow, that what was necessary was an economic Bill of Rights. And to achieve that, we needed a multiracial social movement, which he called the Poor People's Campaign. And around this idea of a prophetic Christian idea of the beloved community that Reverend James Lawson, one of his lieutenants, has continued to articulate up till the present. Actually, a local historian here at University of Washington at Tacoma, Michael Honey, has done some of the most important work on the history of the Poor People's Campaign. It's called Going Down Jericho Road. So in a certain sense, Baldwin's synthesis becomes extraordinarily widespread within the latter part of the 60s. But, and this is what's very critical for us to understand, he had had these ideas since the 1950s and was being ignored. We ignore the voices of the most oppressed at our own peril. By the time that the realization had happened that these grand transformations had to happen in social movements, the white backlash and the resentment and the economic crisis and the war had escalated to such a point that the transformation was very, very difficult to make. Added to that, the various different assassinations, and you had a perfect storm that destroyed some of the most profound opportunities to lead a transformative social movement. And this brings us, I think, to the present moment. How do we learn this lesson of not ignoring the most oppressed voices? If we could have listened to this gay black voice in the 50s, we could have been in a much better place within our civil rights movement. That leads us to a thinking of Black Lives Matter, led in part by transgendered African American women and Afro-Latino women. So this makes us a very interesting statement. Should I pause for a minute while people have to transition? Pause for just one moment. Okay. Everybody have a good class. Thank you for coming. I have a few more things to say for those of you that like to say. Good luck, everyone. Okay. We've reached quorum. All right. We find ourselves in a similar place 50 years later that young people found themselves 50 years ago. But we lack the tools to understand our situation because we have allowed our history to be sanitized. We must seek out this usable past in order to develop social movements for the 21st century. Reading Baldwin is an excellent start. All around us, if we were paying attention, we hear the cries of Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot, and I can't breathe. We see this not only in the marches and protests across the country and across campuses, but also in the everyday acts of solidarity, even in popular culture. We see it in the increasing determination of students of color and poor students to become educated. We see it in the growing police accountability movement and prison reform movement. We see it in the immigrant rights movement. We see it in the recent albums by Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole and other conscious hip-hop artists that are trying to resuscitate the soul of hip-hop. If you ever wondered what it would have been like to live in the civil rights movement, stop wondering. We're living in it right now. Get involved. I'm speaking directly to the young people in the audience. Let me close by saying that while we live in an exciting time of growing activism, we also live in a dangerous time that requires all of the critical thinking skills Baldwin encourages in his reader. Thousands of people are losing their jobs and their homes, millions of deportations and families torn apart, and a police force and a justice system which the average poor person and person of color no longer trusts. Baldwin's writings speak to us clearly as though they were messages in a bottle opened up 50 years later. Do we descend into bitterness and hatred, or do we, as Baldwin asks us to do, turn towards radical love and solidarity? He concluded The Fire Next Time with a haunting warning we must heed today. Quote, he says, "If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now. We may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. The fire next time." Thank you very much.